guys, so apologies in advance about the kind of poor lighting and the very plain background and potentially the echoing. I am in my new bedroom in my new flat, and obviously things are still quite bare, but I actually managed to sit down for half an hour before I go out to film a video finally, because I know it's been a while. So I am here to do my October reading wrap up. Can't believe it's November already, but I read 6 books in October, most of which I think I really enjoyed, so I am really excited to talk to you about them all. Start with the one book I have a physical copy of, which is a graphic novel, and it's 100 Nights of Hero by Isabel Greenberg. I was sent this by the lovely Simon over Savage Reads as a wonderful present, and it was a 5 out of 5 star read, so that was a very successful gift, Simon. This is Isabel Greenberg's second full hardback graphic novel after the Encyclopedia of Early Earth. I gave the first one, they're not sequels, they're just set in the same universe, but I gave the first one 4 out of 5 stars because I felt the ending was quite abrupt, which threw me, but this was just perfect throughout. It's about 2 women who are lovers in a world where women being lovers is frowned upon, it's not acceptable, and women in general have very little rights. They can't read or write or do any of those kind of things without being accused of being a witch. And one of the women's husband basically sets up a bet with his friend that his friend can't seduce his wife, and in order to prevent the friend from actually just forcing himself on this woman, they trick him by telling him a story every night, a bit like 1001 Arabian Nights, is that what that's called? You know what I'm referring to, you know, the story within a story, and they keep telling stories, which is a bit like the first one in this series, but I think it worked especially well in this book. It was just perfect, and the stories were wonderful, and the characters were wonderful. The characters telling the stories and the characters in the stories, and there was just so much to get your teeth into, and Isabel Greenberg is a beautiful artist if you haven't seen her stuff before. And I think if you've been meaning to get into graphic novels, then this is an excellent place to start, as well as excellent for people who already love them. But of course my battery's already flashing because I'm not prepared at all, so let's try and speed through the rest of them. I read 2 non-fiction books, I think, in October, so I'll tell you about them first. The first one I finished, I'd started before the month, was Who Rules the World by Noam Chomsky, and I listened to this one on audiobook, and one thing I will say is that I wouldn't recommend listening to it on audiobook personally. Not because of the narrator, I think the narrator was fantastic. I just felt it was one of those books that there was so much in there that I really wanted to be able to go back, reread passages, refer back to previous essays or chapters, and highlight and tab things and write next to them, and I couldn't do that with an audiobook, so it felt like I sped through it almost too quickly in a way. So I would recommend reading this book over listening to it on audiobook, unless you really don't like reading non-fiction. It wasn't very long though, and it was all about the United States government's history of abuse of its own power. That was not a great sentence there, but you know what I mean. Their interactions in the past few decades with other countries and foreign affairs, and the way in which they assert themselves as a dominance power, even in a really quite illegal and immoral fashion, and it was really interesting. Some of the stuff I knew about, some of it I didn't, and I really need to read more into, because there was a lot covered in the book, and it was covered in a really good introductory way, but there was so much more I needed to know, I felt. But I really enjoyed it. It was my first full Noam Chomsky book. He's an incredible intellectual, and I really admire him, and I'm really glad I finally read one of his books, and I'll definitely be reading more. But the next non-fiction book I read was Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, and this I gave 5 out of 5 stars. It's my second full Angela Davis book, and I gave her last one 5 out of 5 stars as well. I think her work is phenomenal. I sped through this one, I could not put it down. It wasn't very long again, about 120, 130 pages, and it was so consumable. Although it was a really important topic with a lot of history and a lot of contemporary issues, she managed to condense it into a really readable book that gave me a lot of information, and it gave me a history of the prison system, particularly in the US, but she did cover prisons somewhat in other places briefly, and talked about the issues surrounding prisons, because she is a prison abolitionist, and she pointed out what's something I have never thought too much about, although I am aware of the inherent problems in the prison system, sort of the racial and class biases, and definitely appreciated that. But I hadn't thought about the fact of how accepting I am really of prisons existing, especially to the extent they do in modern society. It's something we're all just used to and assume is the only way to do things, whereas that's not necessarily true. And this book was fantastic and I'd highly recommend it. But finally I did read 3 non-fiction books. The first 2 I read for Halloween, and those were Cuckoo Song by Frances Harding, which is a young adult horror novel. Bit of horror, bit of mystery, bit of magic, bit of everything, but really good. I really enjoyed it. It's about Triss, who has had an accident, wakes up from this accident, doesn't know what had happened to her, but everything seems to have changed slightly, and her younger sibling doesn't believe that she's actually Triss anymore, and she doesn't know what's going on, but she's got this strange new appetite and just doesn't feel quite like herself. So it's all about her uncovering that mystery, and one of the things I loved about this book was that by the end of it you were pretty much rooting for what were the monsters, which I loved and I thought was really fun. And then the second Halloween-esque book I read was White is for Witching by Helen Oyeyemi. This is my second Helen Oyeyemi book. I read Boys No Bird recently and talked about it on this channel, and I really enjoyed this book. I thought her prose were spectacularly beautiful, but I found the ending kind of disconcerting and didn't really enjoy what had happened at the end. Did not have that problem with this book. This book didn't have any of those kind of issues in it. It was just fantastic from beginning to end, and it was very creepy. It was predominantly about these generations of women attached to this house, and the house then became the narrator of sections of the book because it felt really possessively towards these women in the family and it didn't want them to leave, and it was really creepy. I mean, houses that come to life is an incredibly creepy horror trope, and it worked really well. Again, her writing was spectacularly beautiful, and there was a really nice, honest, relatable portrayal of a lesbian relationship in it, which was really nice. So there was a lot of story in there despite it being quite a creepy, unsettling read. Not necessarily always full of happiness and joy because, like I said, it is kind of horror, but one I would highly recommend for lots of different readers. And lastly, before my light disappears completely, I read Benefits by Zoe Fairbairns. This book was written in the 1970s and it is a feminist dystopian book. So for fans of Only Ever Yours and Handmaid's Tale, this is a must read. It is one of my mum's all-time favourite books and I've been meaning to read it forever. And I'm so glad I finally did. Gave it 5 out of 5 stars, thought it was fantastic. What was really disconcerting about this dystopian book, which is set in the United Kingdom, is that because it was written in the 1970s, it basically follows through the 1980s, 1990s and early 2000s. So the dystopian is really our world, which is really interesting to see what she got right and what she got wrong. And although she didn't really anticipate the rise of the internet and technology in that fashion, there was some really interesting political stuff that she actually kind of predicted. So she kind of predicted there being a coalition government. She foresaw the kind of scrapping and cut down on state pensions and the general attack on the welfare state, attacks on sort of child rearing benefits and attacks on women's right to choose and generally women's procreational rights. In a various senses, she very much foresaw, based on what was happening in the 70s, what would continue to be issues. Although things haven't gone exactly like the book predicted, it is really interesting. I think it's a really fascinating book to read if you enjoy that kind of reflection on dystopians that the time has now come of, which is really interesting, and I would highly, highly recommend it. It doesn't just start in the dystopian, it starts in the 1970s and you get a bit of the 1970s and a little bit of the sort of 1990s, and then it goes to like the 2000s. So you kind of see the dystopian develop and what becomes of it, and fantastic, would highly recommend. I'm going to do a separate video where I talk about it a little bit more. But those are all of the books I read in October. Do let me know if you have any thoughts on any of the books I have mentioned here or any recommendations for me based on what I've been reading. I would love to hear from you as always, and until next time, which hopefully won't be quite as long, happy reading and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!